The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brooks Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brooks Show on this Thursday. It's almost the end of March, almost in South America. I'll be heading there on Tuesday. So I'm super excited today to have Isiah as my guest. I met Isiah at a seminar at the University of, well, we met before that. I think we met at an OCON in the past.
At an OCON before that, yeah.
We chatted a little bit. At that point, he was like this young kid who had a TikTok channel. That's what I remember. He impressed me at this seminar we had a while back at the University of Texas. That was put on by Greg Salmieri on was it like a 3-day, 2.5-day seminar on racism. And Isiah was one of the people there, and it was a lot of fun, and it was super interesting. So I learned a lot, and there was just whole pieces of American history that I thought, God, I really don't know this stuff. I kind of have a vague notion, a vague idea about it, but really don't know it. And I'm sure my listeners don't know it either. So so I thought it would be a great opportunity, and racial issues in the headlines constantly. Civil rights is talked about, but I don't think very well understood what it means, and what the movement has been, and what it is, and how it's evolved since, over the last 200 years. So I thought, what a great opportunity. We'll get, is it Isiah Ibis? What do you want me to call you?
I normally online, I prefer Ibis, but
you know, so he's Ibis. Right. Yeah. So just to give you a little bit, Ibis is a student of objectivism, an intellectual activist in training. He currently is a student at the Ayn Rand University. So this is also a pitch for the Ayn Rand University. You know, they sponsor the show. So you'll get a flavor, a little bit of that as well. We can also ask Isiah about his experiences there. And he works as an editor for the Undercurrent. And Undercurrent is a publication inspired by the philosophy of objectivism. It's a student publication, or at least was historically. It's been around for a long time, kind of on and off over the years. I guess it's being rebooted. So Isiah or Ibis is part of that reboot. He's an electrician by trade, makes a living as an electrician. Is also engaged in training to become a Montessori guide, while also building the skills of an intellectual historian. And those are some of the skills that impressed me during the seminar. As an intellectual activist, he's involved in many cultural commentary projects and applies philosophy and history to social media landscape. And social media is known as Ibis of Aporia, and is associated with the TikTok YouTube group Aporia. And you can find his, I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and I put the links to it, like his whatever the terminology is, his Twitter thing and his Instagram thing. It's in the description in the bio. So Ibis, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is, a dream come true. My journey started with watching you 3 years ago. So this is actually crazy for me right now.
That is quite crazy. So tell me a little bit about the journey. So let's start with that. So how did you discover me? How did you discover Ayn Rand? And then what's it been like? What's the path been like, if you will?
All right. So, it started pretty much scrolling through YouTube at the beginning of kind of around the maybe a little bit before the pandemic and the lockdown started, going through a lot of Thomas Sowell content, and being very intellectually active, following the trail, getting onto obviously your content and kind of tracking that down. And once I got to you and Sowell and pushing about reading materials, it reignited my passion for reading that was lost to me through the public school system. And It was like, like I like to tell people, all these books behind me didn't exist 3 years ago. So I went at it quite seriously. At that time, I had just began being an electrician's apprentice, and I was having a lot of kind of moments where it was like, how much do I want to deeply become an electrician? Because there's a whole world opening up to me now where there's a lot of stuff for me that I want to say. There's a lot of things I want to do, and then And then the TikTok thing happened. So I'll give you a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I met a lot of people. So of course the lockdowns happened. I was getting paid to stay at home quite well, might I add. So I decided to use my time to learn more and engage with people through, all the different services, TikTok, Discord, Instagram. And even though I wasn't trying to put myself quite out there, I ended up finding some people through different live streams, namely a kid named Larry, who's also part of the Ayn Rand University student. And, after talking to him and kind of putting him on to more of your stuff and Thomas Sowell and all these other different sources of information, I was just like, you know what, man, if we take this stuff to TikTok and kind of challenge what's going on there, I bet you we could get a following. And I always had this mindset where, if you have the right kind of message and you're charismatic about it, you can make a following online. I'm a big proponent of YouTube as one of the greatest services ever. So lo and behold, a massive group gets started that I think at its peak was like, 200 people across different chat rooms. And that was just on the back end. And, the actual TikTok page reached, I think, even now it's sitting at like maybe 60,000 followers with videos hitting 5 million views. We have great feedback. Like, I believe Jen, who works for Ayn Rand Institute, had an instance there she told me about while I was in Austin, where somebody comes up to her and is like, I know Ayn Rand. How do you know him? From the Aporia guys on TikTok. So, we were the TikTok objectivists. And, Rucka reached out and I got to meet all you guys. And, it was away from there. I couldn't leave you guys after that. And,
That's amazing.
Everybody was so receptive.
Good. And are you still on TikTok? Is that still something you do?
We still do it from time to time. Everybody's in college now, which I kind of predicted. Everybody started to go to college, which, I'm very happy about because everybody's, doing well and very motivated to what they're doing. And everybody's training their writing skills. But there's a plan to go back to TikTok. But mostly the bigger plan is to, kind of give you some competition and start a YouTube channel and start a bunch of YouTube channels. And
Excellent.
Substack as well. I'm a big proponent of Substack as well.
And me too. Though can't get it going, but I am a proponent of it. One of these days we'll get it going.
One of these days.
But is YouTube more appealing because of the longer format? Yeah, that's great.
So yes, I want to crack the code on the longer format, edited content, and just being a good mixing that kind of combination and harmony of entertainment and information, education. And I think, like I always say, YouTube is going to be around forever. And I just think it's too important of a tool. It got me here. So
I agree. I agree completely. As you know, and I spent a lot of time on here, but I'm looking forward to competition. I'm looking forward to lots of competition. The more the better. This is good stuff. So what got you interested in the civil rights movement, in particular, kind of the early civil rights movement, the 19th century civil rights movement? How did your focus go there?
Okay. So right before I maybe discovered objectivism and its, theory of rights and all that, I just Googling around. I'm a big Wikipedia guy as well. Googling around, clicking through sources on Wikipedia, following the kind of chain in the trail, being a good detective. I discovered that there was this thing called an 1860 civil rights movement. And I found that completely interesting and peculiar, that I never heard of such a thing. And, as that information started to align with what I was learning from more libertarian sources and more objectivist information, I kind of put together, like, why don't people talk more about this history and what was going on here? And it just kind of snowballed from there. And, I found out it just kind of things aligned where this new kind of scholarship, so most of the books, the most important books that I've read on this topic came out recently, 2022, 2021. So it's this open field of scholarship. And it just, even these non-objectivist scholars end up talking so much about individual rights and all these different things. So it was,
well, I mean, if you're talking 1860s, that's the context. The context is a debate about individual rights. So let's really go back there. So the United States is founded, a constitution is established, but as we know, slavery is institutionalized in the south of the in the southern states. To what extent, from your readings, was this challenged? Was this were people upset about it? Was there real conflict going into, let's say, the 19th century?
So this is one of those things I want to spend a good amount of time talking about this, but it was challenged from the very beginning, and the challenge never let up. And I think that's it's something that's kind of it seems to kind of fell on the wayside in the discussion of Americans' history. It never sat right with different sectors of America, and it was always a hot topic for debate. And immediately, and I want to talk about I always pose this question when talking about this topic: what made America so special? What makes America so unique? And we talk about, we have this phrase like the peculiar institution of slavery, and what made it so peculiar. And one of the ways to view that is that we had these founding documents, these founding principles that made that idea of slavery seem completely contradictory. And this was constantly pressed on. And it was always at war in the intellectual scene.
So there were intellectuals debating this. I know in the South, there was during the early part of the 19th century, there was a real intellectual effort to try to justify slavery, right? I mean, there were a lot of people, Calhoun, and there were a lot of people writing about the virtues of slavery and why this was necessary. Was there an opposition in the South, or was the opposition really from intellectuals in the North?
So let me set this up a little bit here. So one of the interesting things that when talking about this kind of from the framework of this first civil rights movement, and one of the things that's key to think about this is, so early on in the North, what happens is a lot of the states start with abolishing some gradually, most of them gradually abolish slavery, especially like, for example, the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 put slavery on a gradual abolishing path. And what you end up getting is this question of what does a post-slavery society look like? Pretty much the questions that end up getting asked and dealt with in Reconstruction, the same questions came up in the early part of America. So instantly, you have this issue, and a lot of these northern states end up implementing these anti-Black racist laws. Registration for Blacks to migrate, registration for Blacks to get residency, blocking testimony, so Blacks weren't allowed to testify in court cases that had to do with whites. And yeah, all these things that I think, we kind of think of racist laws as Jim Crow stuff, but these things are kind of a little bit very extreme. And a lot of this served as a way to push away a lot of the Black migration that was coming to the North from the South, because we have the South still having slave states. We obviously have a large influx. So one of the things to know about the founding is there was a large resurgence of escaped slaves, manumitting slaves. So, nothing too crazy to like completely overthrow. Yeah, but it was a significant uptick before, compared to before the revolution. So this is the context we're coming into. And when you have these declarations being made, these documents being posed and being ratified, you get what can be called, you get a group of people who are often referred to as the Black founders. A lot of these early Black Americans, free Black Americans, who pick up this language, pick up the founding principles of this nation and begin to ask this question. Why is there such a contradiction in, of course, the slave states, but even in the North? Why are we making racial distinctions in the law? This is completely against the principles of the country, and it cannot stand.
And to what extent do they use the language of individual rights? To what extent do they talk about individual rights as the founding principle of the country?
I mean, of course, just like the founding of the country itself, it can be mixed in with religious language, but it is explicit. We're talking about people who learn from, the founding generation as well. So it is explicit. They're calling on natural rights theory. They're calling on this language of we are all created equal. They're explicitly saying rights. They're using this word right. Sometimes they use the phrase in reference to the privilege and immunities clause that's found in the Constitution. They're calling explicitly on these words and on these concepts as a way to frame their arguments and pose their arguments and into the debate. Obviously, so one of the things I like to mention to people that not a lot of people know, and this will come back later in the history, is that 10 out of 13 of these colonies, Blacks were a part of ratifying and voting for the Constitution, which
Okay. They
interesting
had
fact.
the vote in 10 of 13 of the colonies.
Yeah, they were part of ratifying the Constitution. So it's not like these things were happening and the Black population was not aware of them. So they were very much engaged in the ideals and the ideas in the country. And that's why you get this kind of very, very, in the early republic, there's this strong sense of what can be termed as Black Americanism, as what a lot of people call it, because there's always this language of our founding fathers, our country. Wow. It's never this, it's very, of course you get a few sporadically, but it's never in a sense like we're completely done with this nation. It's always in recognition of these principles are right, they're true, they're, of course, in their language, they're Christian, they're, God created us all equal, but they are very, in essence, very individualistic and very much in that mode.
Now, I think a lot of people know Frederick Douglass, and of course, one of the great orators and one of the great writers in history, and one of the great defenders, I think, of the concept of individual rights. Yeah. To what extent does he stand out? That is he part of a group of thinkers? Is he extraordinary even in the context of the time?
I think he is very extraordinary in the context of the time, but he is actually what I would call part of more of the second generation of this movement. So one of his rivals, you could say, and by the way, I would always like to point out, just in the mode of, like I say, the founding fathers, these were not monolithic views. They were even in the Black community among whether they were free advocates and all these intellectuals, they were always contesting and debating their ideas. So one of Douglass's famous rivals is a gentleman called Charles Lennox Reman, who by far, reading this history, is one of my favorite, and we'll get into why he's one of my favorite in a little bit here. But he was the top orator before Frederick Douglass, and that's part of the tension between them. But Douglass ends up naming his kid after him and all this. But so Douglass is part of the more second generation, but he does stand out as a unique figure in his, I think, as I would term, he's very individualistic, very fundamental in his language and his talking. He goes right to the heart of the issue, and he covers a very wide range of topics that that go far past just slavery. And we can get into some more of that, but just to name some other heroes so people can have things to Google. We have gentlemen like James Forten, who participated in the American Revolution, who then becomes a wealthy salesmaker and part of the Boston, Philadelphia crowd. We have Robert Purvis, another big advocate of equal rights. And again, these aren't just, and maybe this can point to why some of this history isn't too focused on, is because we get overshadowed by the whole abolitionist label, and we lose track of, what comes after we end slavery is, well, what do the laws look like? What do these rights, what are the exact rights that people have, these freed people? So we have gentlemen, like I said, James Forten, Robert Purvis, Absalom Jones. Another favorite of mine is Richard Allen, who's a preacher. But again, so I'll say this, even the religious figures, again, are very much, even when they use their religious language and use their religious arguments, when they're talking and speaking, they're very much in the mode of also flipping into political arguments, always calling on the Declaration, the Constitution, of course, those famous words, we are all created equal. And it's the through line of this Americanism is so strong, it can't be ignored.
That's amazing. I mean, it's what do you think explains the fact that we don't really know these names, that we don't really know about anything about these figures?
I mean,
and how, let me ask you this, how well known are they within the Black community today?
So obviously the general public, almost not well known at all. You'll see mention of them. Of course, they're on some of they get brought up on the Black websites. People may know Prince Hall because he's a part of, the church and these Masonic kind of organizations, and Richard Allen too, but pretty much almost no mention of them. Now, to go to your first question, like I said, I indicated that we kind of get lost in the whole abolitionist label. Mm-hmm. So that explains why some of it gets overshadowed. But also, I think it's, these people were very much in that pro-America, even though it had its squabbles in their debates. And some of them, debated this and had to change their mind over their life. But they were very much in that pro-America mode. This is our country. One of them, Reverend Richard Williams, actually has a speech literally titled, "This is our country" in 1830. Wow. Like these people were very much in the camp of, regardless of the contradictions or what may be happening now, who's ruining the country now. That was the view. There's people in the country now whose ideas are tainting the founders' view, and they looked at the founders with this reverence that they use language like our dear fathers. It always, when they talk, it has this reverence and this love for the founders to it. That's you just don't find today.
So it didn't bother them, or did it, that the founders were slave owners, that some of the founders at least were slave owners?
It absolutely didn't. This is why I appreciate the perspective Objectivism gave me as well. Like, sure. Of course, they took note of these things and they mentioned it often. And even, when it came up in some pro-slavery, pro-racist arguments that founders were slave owners, but they would say, no, that does not take away from the fundamental principles of the nation. That doesn't a contradiction in the application of the principle doesn't change that the principle is right, and that we with our minds as individuals can work out that these principles are correct and should be followed. And even if that, of course, I keep alluding to the fact that even though if that was couched in some type of religious, sure, God created us all, of course.
I mean, everybody, the founders' language was couched in that as well. So it's everywhere during this period. So what do you think they would think of today's, call it civil rights movement? I don't know if you want to call it that, but, kind of today's hatred of the founding, hatred of the founders, and a lot of that based on the fact that they owned slaves.
I mean, this was part of, like, in the 1830s, this became part of the debate. I mean, and from a slight tint, you could see this as one of the debates with between Garrison and Frederick Douglass and the Garrisonian camp of this whole, are we going to engage in the political process to undo slavery? We both do not like slavery, but how are we going to go about fighting it? Are we just going to give up on the country as a whole? Are we going to give up on the Constitution as a whole? Is the Constitution an evil document? Or is it a fundamentally good document that we can use? We can press people to essentially say, do better. And they would find, I think, a large majority, even some of those who wanted to leave, who ended up in the opinion of we wanted to leave America, were still on the side of, they still claim the Declaration of Independence as a great document. The founding principles is a great document. So they would be completely at odds, I think, with the civil rights movement. And let me say one more other thing to indicate why Charles Lennox Reman was one of my favorites, and we can get more into this later, but especially when we talk about Reconstruction. But in the 1830s, 1840s, he was already drawing a distinction between what they term civil rights and social rights, which essentially came down to, he was drawing a distinction between equality under the law and what, equality in society, how we are treated, or the kind of private public distinction. And he was in very clear terms he was drawing this distinction. And it's an incredible thing to read. Frederick Douglass also drew the same distinction, and a couple other advocates, some white advocates as well, Wendell Phillips, drew this distinction, which was an understanding of rights that it wasn't popular, it wasn't like widespread at the time. But
spell this out, like play it out. What is how did they view this playing out? Yeah, go ahead.
So first, let me explain what they meant by civil rights, because as you alluded to in the beginning, which was very good, that it's an ambiguous term. Its meaning has changed over time. So by civil rights, they understood civil rights at the time to mean essentially what they would allude to natural rights and the right to mobility, liberty, freedom of contract, freedom of property, and due process of law in courts. And, and social rights, later on, it becomes a big hubbub in the Reconstruction era, but it was this idea of, this distinction of getting rid of the charge that, you were trying to legislate, white people trying to treat you a certain way with their own in private association. So he even uses the word, you should be free to associate. We should be free to associate and make our own decisions with people. But that is a completely different thing than the law coming in, stepping in, and forcing.
So social rights is about how we interact with one another on a voluntary basis. Civil rights is in a sense relates to our relationship with the government, or the government's relationship to us.
Yes, and it comes through very strongly. A lot of it, I wouldn't say most, but some of my favorite advocates, like I allude to, Remand, even Justice Harlan, even though he's a mixed bag, Frederick Douglass, were very much clear of, we're trying to focus on equality under the law, and we're not looking to be treated nice, and that is something we have the ability to solve by all means. I like to point out what this other point is. Most of these guys, besides if they were preachers or orators, also usually had a successful trade. They were successful businessmen. Some of them were quite wealthy. Actually, that's how a lot of these things got funded. So the world of doing business and having your business acumen and your ability to be known around the neighborhood and around your community, they saw how much that could carry you socially. So
and I was thinking that these guys had some amazing self-esteem to be able to stand up to the world around them, stand up to the conventional wisdom, and then articulate this amazing radical case that was consistent with the founders, but that much of America turned their back against. And that self-esteem, it makes sense to me that self-esteem possibly comes from their achievements in business. That is, that those two are connected.
It's absolutely incredible. Remand actually himself came from quite a family of hard workers, wealthy people who made it in a couple different business ventures. I think his main one was chimney cleaning, which was quite big at the time. James Forten was a ship maker, sail maker.
And where did they live in the North? So they lived all in.
These are Massachusetts. Well, Forten was a Philadelphia guy, and Remand was a Massachusetts guy, Boston. So. Yeah.
All right, so these intellectuals are working in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. They're part of the abolition movement, or would you say adjacent to? They're part of the abolition movement?
They're adjacent to the abolition movement. Some of them aren't in the anti-slavery society. Some are, but they're adjacent to it. They're part of those causes. But so actually, let me step back a little bit and back to what makes America different, and kind of how the context and structure of America's system kind of set up these fights and these debates, is that because of America's ideas on self-governance, and you probably know a lot about this as well, America's ideas on self-governance, how that was understood at the time, even though they were pushing away from the more British form of government, there was this strong impulse to have a lot of power in the state. And, that's where we get this whole states' rights thing from. And one of the major challenges of this whole civil rights battle is pushing against the state's ability to regulate, specifically regulate individual rights. So there's this concept called the domestic police powers, which David Bernstein, who's talked a lot about this, and this is a connection to this also comes up in COVID and recently has came up a lot. This domestic police power, which explicitly gives states the ability to regulate individual rights, is a big component of this civil rights movement, and why a lot of these battles start on that kind of grassroots state level. And these movements were kind of focused in the states, and they become kind of the training grounds for a lot of these activists, and who then get related to some of these politicians like Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, and a lot of these guys who get their early start in these states, who then become big figures in the federal government in Reconstruction. And we see that's kind of the through line of how these ideas make it into essentially changing the Constitution.
So, so we have all this leads ultimately to a civil war. I assume these intellectuals are all active during the Civil War in support of the North and trying to what extent are they thinking about what's going to happen after the Civil War? To what extent are they preparing for post-Civil War world?
Very much so. I mean, during the war, they're advocating. There's a big push. There's a lot of, you can find a lot of speeches at the time of them, a little bit during and before the war. You can find advocacy for equal pay for the soldiers. They're already making bids to, in conversation with Lincoln, pushing Lincoln to, engage Blacks who want to fight. Give them equal pay, give them a chance to earn, what's the saying, put a musket in his hand and give him his freedom, and they will willingly fight for it, and, there's a big push. And there's the story I like to tell about, kind of, so I'll mention this, one of my hobbies and interests in reading history is I want to start writing and learn how to write. Thank you, Ayn Rand University. I want to write and be able to write some screenplays and turn some of these historical events into a nice couple of TV shows.
Absolutely.
I think there's some really cool moments. So there's this moment of this guy named Robert Smalls who escapes from the South, steals a ship, does this whole, sneaky disguise thing, steals a ship in the middle of the night, and makes it to the North. And then he's part of this effort, this major effort. And he's kind of like the icing on the cake to convince Lincoln to give Black soldiers equal pay. And that goes right along the line with the arguments that people like Frederick Douglass was making at the time, and people like John Mercer Langston was making at the time. And a lot of these guys during the Civil War were making speeches preempting the Reconstruction era for equality under the law, and already getting ready for the fact that once this war is over, from experience with this earlier period that I told you about, they already know what happens when there's a post. It's kind of like a formula. Post-slavery, when slavery ends, there's immediately the question of what are these rights that free Black people are going to have, and we have to answer that, and we have to know what that looks like.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say there's one more thing I should mention with this. So. Yeah. Just to kind of indicate how much these activists had it on their mind and others didn't. So William Lloyd Garrison, when the Civil War ends, he's like, oh, as an abolitionist, the 13th Amendment has passed, job's done, guys. Time to, put up my hand. Mind you, he started in the 1830s, loved white figure. He was completely cherished for his work, but he's kind of like, oh, the fight's done. The abolition of slavery, we did it, guys. And, Frederick Douglass kind of chimes back like, no, it's not done. Look at what, look at the Black laws that they implemented in some of these free Northern states. Like it is not over by a long stretch. And, he has a speech title. I don't know the exact title, but it kind of goes along the lines of old snake, new skin type of thing. And, it's be wary of abolition, and the end of slavery is just not even half the battle, maybe 25% of the battle. There's so much more to do when it comes to what does equality under the law look like, and what are the proper rights of not just Blacks, but citizens, women. This is where they call it the women question starts to come into focus very much. And that's why I like to say, this is, I don't frame this as Black history or African American history. This is very much textbook American history. And this is very much the intellectual contribution of Blacks. A lot of people talk about how Black people built America, and they talked about concrete things like inventions or cotton or slave, and all that stuff may be, true, but I think they're completely missing the intellectual contributions far outweigh some of the more material concrete things that are like, you can't disregard the contribution to the 14th Amendment that ends up becoming the 14th Amendment, which, if you flip it back, was essentially what James Madison was arguing for in the Federalist Papers. That's just, I like to mention that to show the through line of how significant these ideas are. Sorry about that long.
Couple of questions. So first, where is the North in terms of these racist laws but during the Civil War, before the Civil War? Are they still holding on to some of these laws? Are some of them being repealed? I mean, and how extensive are they? To what percentage of the North has these kind of racist laws in the books?
So percentage-wise is hard. I'll say this. So you have places like Vermont and Maine who pride themselves on being completely, without a doubt, non-racialist societies. They were, completely the best on this type of thing. Places like Massachusetts, with that Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, they are far more in the middle, so to speak. The battles, they don't get as bad as what can be termed as the Northwest states, and more the border Northwest states that are right on the border of the South for obvious geographical reasons. So as the slaves start to migrate, freed people, escaped slaves start to migrate from the South to these northern states, that's when a lot of these racist ideas and this, like you mentioned, this argument that slavery is good and a positive starts to pick up. And that really hits in the 1830s. And that's when this history really gets going and these battles really get going, because that's when a lot of these state constitutions and this legislation really hits, that we need to restrict migration. We need to discourage migration. We need to essentially use these regulations to make life a living hell for Black people, so they will stop coming to the state. It will be, which they didn't.
How many of these states had laws, for example, that returned slaves to the South, escaped slaves?
Well, the fugitive slave law was actually broad scale federal.
Okay,
it was federal.
Yeah.
But and that became a whole fiasco because it essentially made a lot of these as the thought changed in the North, it became like, you guys are trying to impose, these, like how Ayn Rand kind of mentions the feudalistic type character of the South trying to impose itself onto the North. And it very much becomes this expansion, this war of expansion of slavery and encroachment onto the North. But I'd say a good 40-50% of these states are implementing these laws to discourage migration, which is a good, as I like to talk about, it provides good concretes to think about the immigration topic of today. And because a lot of literally the same language was thrown out, there's Black people, they're coming, they're taking our jobs, they're going to be on welfare. In fact, I should mention a big part of these anti-Black laws were grafted onto what was called poor or vagrancy laws of the time, because the idea was, already they had laws that said, paupers and these vagrants are a class that should be, either imprisoned or done away with, gotten rid of out of the state or out of the locality. And then pretty much, the argument just took, once you mix in the races and the argument just took a step up, Blacks inherently will become vagrants if they're allowed to be free. That's why we need to keep them as slaves, yada, yada, yada. And therefore, that's how the connection was made.
So I'm curious if you've seen the movie Amistad, and if so, what do you think of it?
I have a long time ago, so it's kind of not fresh in my memory. But it's on my list. I'm gonna watch it again. But from what I remember, it's an amazing movie. It's an amazing
one of my
movie.
favorites. I think it's, from my perspective, I think it's the best Steven Spielberg movie. Other than maybe his E.T. and his fun kids movies. I think it's his best serious movie that he ever made, and I think it's a fantastic movie. Yeah. But it deals with this period, and it's very, very powerful, and beautifully acted, just beautifully acted. All right, let's see. So Civil War happens. So what are the, just pure history? Just what happens after the Civil War? So the North is occupying the South. They're freeing slaves. The slaves are free. How are they treated? How do the laws change? And then how does that evolve? So let's first start with just the facts, because I think so many people don't know what actually happens after the Civil War.
So the first thing to really ground people's thinking on this is to realize, like I mentioned, this whole issue of the power of the federal government versus the states is completely fresh in everybody's mind. It's not just a South thing. It's completely fresh. So there's this whole back and forth over how much can we really do to free the slaves? What can Congress do? It has jurisdiction over the District of Columbia, but can that extend into freeing the slaves in the country as a whole? And what are the powers of the president becomes a whole thing. And that whole issue gets brought in, obviously, when what happens, since we are militarily occupying the South, and then the next step is, what are we going to do with these rebel states? And as you
so is the question of is the Emancipation Proclamation legit? Is that a real question?
It was a real question at the time, and people still debate it today. Was it legit? And basically that whole discrepancy is over the fact of, was the federal government overstepping its powers? Was that just something that could be a military measure? And it basically started it started as a military measure, and then once the federal government solidified its position as this is a just use of federal power, it became legitimate as a not just military, not just an under occupation thing. This is the law of the land type of thing. And then
of course the 14th Amendment helps with that, right? So
yes, I was just about to say that's where you get the 14th Amendment, and in the same year you get the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to solidify. They're meant to solidify the fact that all badges of slavery, all these different kind of indications of the slave rule and the slave holder mentality is to be eradicated out of the country as a whole. And this is like where I like to say civil rights goes federal with the 14th Amendment. And that's the vision. And that's where the whole, and for it can be hard to understand from kind of our modern perspective, like, why are they debating so much over what the federal government can do, especially sometimes from our perspective, where it's like the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. And, of course, the federal government can step in when the state government isn't doing that. But in fact, at that time, and pretty much until the 14th Amendment, it was seen as the reverse. State governments completely defined, had complete, like way too much latitude over defining, what were the individual rights of women, children. Women can only have this much property in marriage, and they got to regulate all those type of things and define what individual rights essentially were. So
what happens? What goes wrong? Because obviously, there seem to be some good intentions here right after the war, and with the 14th Amendment, the first civil rights bill, there's an attempt to really eradicate slavery and provide equal protection under the law. And then things seem to take a bad turn. What's
nosedive.
the history there?
So obviously, Lincoln getting assassinated doesn't help. There's always that what if question. What if Lincoln? And we could talk more about Lincoln's role in all of this. But I indicated this kind of question of what is civil rights and what did that actually mean? And this to me, I think, is central to what happened in the Reconstruction era, because this is where the debate becomes fully explicit. We have the records from the Reconstruction debates. You know, they're literally asking what is civil rights mean? What's encompassed in that category? And they start creating all these other categories of political rights. So there's civil rights, as I explained to you before, and then there's political rights, which is voting and sitting on juries and stuff like that. And then there's this category of social rights, and they mix all these things up. And what ends up happening is, especially after the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is passed, is, you know, the civil rights cases in the 1880s happens. And a lot these debates end up without this concept being able to be objectively defined and grounded. Some of this stuff gets thrown out. And one of the big discrepancies, as I indicated before, was, you know, how far is the government able to go in protecting, quote, civil rights? You know, especially in this question of public accommodations, this becomes a pretty big issue as well. You know, does that mean this public conveyance, this public accommodation, this streetcar, this hotel, this inn is able to be regulated? And then, of course, that gets thrown out because the opposition says, you know, no, the government can't intercede with private affairs. And then I'll just add this in, which if you watch one of the brilliant parts of Justice Harlan's dissent, if you read it, is that he points out that, in fact, the states were already, for like 100 years, 50 years before this, were regulating in such a way that said, no, these things were not only state sponsored, they were state funded, they were owned. That's what the public meant. So you get this whole confusion over, and anyone who's interested in when objectivism talks about public-private distinctions, this is like one of the greatest things to study on how much, if you don't get this public-private distinction thing right, it causes so much confusion, to the point where essentially the bad guys make the argument for private. You guys are encroaching on our private property, but yet that isn't private property. That is state funded, state sponsored. And of course, the good guys don't go the extra step to say, no, that may not be a state founded institution like the police or something, but that is a fully state sponsored and, in fact, state regulated. You have a whole list of regulations, you know, and that we may not think of it in time now, but that went for inns, hotels, these streetcars. These things were state regulated, state licensed institutions.
So all this confusion about property rights and what they mean, and civil rights and what they mean, is this a sign that kind of that generation of intellectuals in the 1830s went around in the 1870s, or it wasn't clear enough, or the new generation of intellectuals were just not as committed to individual rights or as sharp?
It wasn't clear enough. The clarity did not, as I'd say, in my opinion, the clarity did not cut through enough for the arguments to stick and for the arguments to reach, you know, just one defined push. You know, essentially you had people on the same side coming at it from different angles. There was no clear definition of, even like amongst Black activists, and even between them and the white politicians, what we mean by civil rights is different. Should civil rights include what we mean by social rights? And some are saying, yes, no, we want social equality, that should be included. And you get one of the indicators of this confusion is you even get, at the times of these laws passing, the general public, Black people, start going into certain businesses, not even separate from the public accommodations, and they get discriminated on, and they're like, whoa, that's against the law now. And, you know, it's a complete confusion of concepts. So I wouldn't, some of them were around, some of them unfortunately died young. I think some of the best ones died young, but once things got heavily political, and later people like Booker T. Washington comment on this as well. Once things got got into the game of politics, and we start, mixed economy, you talk about this a lot. Once we get into the pressure politics and the pull game, a lot of the trying to find clarity of the fundamental distinctions and all of that, it kind of falls to the wayside, and that's where the ball drops. And I'll say one more thing. And you can kind of see indicators of this in the fact that even though a lot of these advocates in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s were pushing for racial equality under the law, I mentioned the vagrancy laws, it wasn't like after they got that racial equality, after they were able to repeal some of these things in the 1850s, right? It wasn't like they then turned around and said, you know what? We should also apply this, this would go extend to women's rights or vagrancy laws. Such a class distinction shouldn't be made in the law, period. But, they weren't going that deep, that fundamental, and a lot of that, the ground kind of collapsed under them.
So tell us a little bit about what actually happens during Reconstruction. That is, to what extent, now slavery's gone, slavery's illegal, but what happens in the South and in terms of the quality of life or the kind of life and the laws that are passed in the South post Civil War?
So there's obviously you get Johnson in the presidency after Lincoln's assassinated, and he's a little bit more lenient and a little bit more conciliatory towards the South. So obviously eventually the federal government and the military they make compromises and they pull back, they pull out. And immediately after that, these Southern governments start implementing, just like in the North, 80 years before in the history I was talking about, they start implementing their Black codes and their Black laws. And even though they may be on the face of racially neutral, they still have, just like perfect example is the vagrancy laws, they still have class distinctions, and they're still able to set up their governments in such a way that discriminate, that do not properly protect and offer equality under the law. And eventually the system, they incrementally build their way up till you get to the 1890s, and you have things like Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, and that's, you're just a hop skipping away to Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like,
when did Jim Crow laws actually passed?
Jim Crow laws hit in the early 1900s, but you can see the precursors to it happen in this kind of Reconstruction period.
And to what extent during this period, and then during the early days of Jim Crow laws in the early part of the 20th century, to what extent are there Black intellectuals speaking out against this, fighting against this, making arguments against it? Is there a civil rights movement of the turn of the 20th century?
There absolutely is. That's when you get people like W.E. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Douglass dies in a little in there, so he's not as prominent, but T. Thomas Fortune, people are around, but obviously this is a new generation, kind of just like the switch after the 1960s. You get a new generation of civil rights activists. There's some definitely who, in my opinion, are more of the socialist leaning. So socialism hits quite hard.
Aggressive movements.
Yeah. And it gets as passionate as they are for equality and against racism, the arguments very much change. They lose, to me, in my opinion, they lose that flavor of calling on the founding principles, calling on the founding documents, and and really going towards and using what is right about the American system fundamentally to their advantage. It all kind of gets muddled into the language of equality, and equality kind of becomes this, again, it becomes this broad amorphous term that can encompass so many things, and you get these explicit calls for social equality. And like I said, you get W.E. Du Bois and the whole W.E. Du Bois and Booker T kind of fight. And you get things like, even though Booker T. Washington is against segregation laws, and he has a whole ideology towards how to combat this system arising in the South, and how to heal and move forward between blacks in the South, whites in the South, and as the country and as a whole, and heal race relations. You get groups like W.E. Du Bois kind of attacking him and going against him, and in my opinion, smearing him and smearing his position. So it's, you kind of get this breakdown, in my opinion.
So there's a parallel, which is not surprising, between white intellectuals and black intellectuals. They're all, in a sense, by the turn of the century, losing that connection with individual rights, with the founding principles, and an understanding of the Constitution, of the Declaration. It's
absolutely amazing how, like, some of these people, like, for example, again, W.E. Du Bois is the key example, like, literally schooled in Europe type of thing, schooled in Russia, had schooled abroad, they come back and they influence others with this ideology. And it's like you hit it right on the head. It's the intellectual shift completely changes. You even have, you have the later generation even criticizing Douglass, and maybe Douglas is those, typical, those old timey Douglas ideas won't work. We need something new, and the newness is it's more reactionary than, in my opinion, fundamental and more principled.
Yeah, I know, it's tragic how the about 100 years after founding, 120 years after founding, there's almost no intellectual standing up for the ideas of the founding, and the ideas and really the key idea of individual rights, and therefore the whole debate gets distorted and perverted. All the debates, not just the debate about race, but the debates about everything.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, at the turn of the century, you especially as people get involved in politics. I mean, there was an uptick in Reconstruction in Black political leaders, which is often cited by people as a very positive thing. I'm on the side that, yes, it can show progress, but it shouldn't be your main indicator of good things just because they're in politics. In fact, once you get into that pull game, when you uncover a lot of that story, is a lot of things that just, that's when you start seeing it's not just Black people are voting for the Republican Party anymore. You get this whole, we're pushing towards this Democrat side. We're pushing towards these more socialistic views, where we're looking for more social policy, social programs, a whole slew of different, political things that it's a less focused and principled movement altogether.
So Jim Crow laws started in the early part of the 20th century. Part of the response to that is a massive migration of Blacks to the North. How are they treated in the North? What happens in the North as a consequence of this big migration up North?
So, obviously in the North at the time, it's not like the North of the older years where we have, these registration laws and all these kind of things. But the North is a little bit more welcoming. The North is a little bit, it shows more signs of opportunity, but the obvious problem, which is pointed out by a lot of people at the time, including Washington and people later on in the civil rights movement, is that a lot of the Black population are Southerners. They've been Southerners for a long time, and you have a cultural clash that happens in the North, and that often people have noted that clash isn't just racial, it's intraracial, in the sense that Northern Blacks and Southern Blacks clash, and a lot of these economic and issues start to clash with each other. This prospect of jobs and finding work, and the whole prospect of how cities are, and because we start to get the boom of cities and the outgrowth of cities, and that these attitudes start to form around that. And that's, I think, early on, this is when you get to see the shift towards the Democrat Party as well, when you get towards the Depression and things like that. And that's when the big push towards social programs and those type of movements really get going. And the idea that we're voting for who offers us programs and social security, and yeah. And
so, but there were quite a few racist laws in the North. I mean, redlining was a real thing, and it was government redlining and minimum wages. I've heard economists like Walter Williams argue the minimum wage were basically passed as a way to keep blacks out of not be able to compete with the unions. Again, absolutely. Very similar to the debates about immigration today.
Yeah, spot on. And one other thing, which people mention redlining a lot, but what I think is even more interesting is you get residential zoning laws as well, mm-hmm. which are very, very, very impactful. And, just it shows a sign of, even mind you that this whole movement, a war has happened. There's been a whole push for equality under the law, and you have to kind of ask yourself how has such a reversion happened, and it takes a good 40 years after that to get a big mass movement pushed against that.
So let's talk about the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, which is what most people think about when they think about civil rights movements, because because that's more recent memory, I guess, and the impact that they had on current culture. What characterizes the civil rights movement as compared to previous ones, as compared to the one before the war and the turn of the century civil rights movements? What was different about the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s?
I think, well, one thing to note is it was, where I want to tackle this. The 50s and 60s movement, as you noted, I asked you in a talk when I was there in Austin, I asked you about this, about, I believe you were giving a talk on China, and I asked you why didn't they take on, they were intellectuals. It was an intellectual movement, in my opinion, not as strong of an intellectual movement, founded and rooted in the principles of America as this first civil rights movement, this movement of yesteryear, these Black founders, and kind of drawing heavily on and really having a positive view towards what America could be and should be. Even though they use the language of what America could be and should be, I think it was animated by this kind of fed up attitude, right? In some cases, rightfully so.
Yep.
But and that was understandable. But in terms of like political philosophy and ideology, it did not have the same underpinnings, and it had this kind of idea of you guys, something is owed to us in terms of programs need to be set up. It needs to go farther. One book I'm fond of for this that most people don't know about is Martin Luther King's final book, which is called Where Do We Go From Here? And it's the final book he wrote. So it's after the Civil Rights Act is passed, and it's like the last book he wrote, and where he talks about, and why I suggest that is, and bring that up, is it gives you a flavor of, first of all, he talks a lot about his Stokely Carmichael. He talks a lot about the young militants, the new burgeoning group that have came along with him, that are seem to be getting purchase and getting rise after the success of his civil rights movement. But he also very much frames his ideas of how much farther we have to go, and it's very much in the mode of that farther. Of course, he pays service to the fact that there's individual personal aspects that people in the Black community have to do, but a large part of it is based in what the collective can do, and this idea of this huddling of the masses together, and this mass movement of what we have to kind of bond together to do to help each other out, and where I think is very much in contrast to the earlier movement was very much about let's remove these legal barriers, and then our individual abilities and capabilities are going to push us forward. And there was, I mean, like I said, a lot of the guys and people have made, historians have noticed this, a lot of the civil rights leaders of the 1960s were not so much businessmen, they were preachers, except for one of my favorites, T.R.M. Howard, who I suggest everybody should look into. Besides him, a lot of them were more on the preacher, activists. You get this activist side of it, besides the political activist type of thing. And versus, you know, the earlier movement was full of, even before they were political activists, they were activists in their communities. They were activists in the sense of setting up mutual aid societies. They put their money where their mouth was, literally. They were fundraising, they were setting up institutions, building their own schools. And, you know, some of them were traveling to Africa traveling to Africa and Canada to see if other opportunities existed while running their businesses, coming back to America and saying, hey, we can go here, but even if we go here, we still have to fight. We still have to fight in America for our country. And there was very much that view of, there wasn't much of, even the guys who are like, this country's messed up and there might be no hope, they were still like, this is our country and we deserve to have a right to be citizens here. I think in 1960s, there's a lot of elements of, you know, we got to get away from white people. We got to get rid of white people. White people are no good for us. You know, they can just only be allies to our movement. Whereas, you know, I didn't touch on this, but I mean, the first civil rights movement has a boatload of white civil rights heroes that should also get a lot of acclaim and recognition. That, you know, the Black activists were very much engaged with, they were friends with. You know, these people slept, ate, stayed together. When conventions and congregations happened, these people were working together, close knit. So you don't get this same type of hate. You get a lot of reverence. I always tell this story of, which I would love to depict on TV, is Charles Sumner, as he's like he's dying on his deathbed, and he's like, please pass my Civil Rights Act, because he's vying in Congress for the Civil Rights Act. That's his last dying words to Frederick Douglass. You know, yeah. And there's a lot of other stories like that. It's just powerful moments.
So would you say that the earlier civil rights movements, to one extent or another, were individualistic, and that by the 60s it's already collectivism, and then today it's almost racism? I mean, it's kind of, the civil rights have evolved into segregationists themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely how I would characterize it. I mean, there's almost, to my knowledge, there's no claims of anything like affirmative action, anything like special handouts. In some cases, there's even, you know, the way they, especially in the earlier years, the way they make their arguments, they're like, you know, there's this case of Paul Cuffey. This is like flying back to the 1780s, where he's like, you know, if you guys are going to tax us for something, we want our rights. If not, we don't tax us. But we and there's very much playing with the idea of taxation and handouts, and we don't want relief, and making arguments that we pay more into relief than we take, and we're not going to be a burden. They were so here's something that comes out in this earlier movement. One of the charges against them was this idea that they're inferior and they're going to be on the dole. They're just going to be a burden. They were so adverse to this idea that they were very much critical intra the Black community. Like, you know, those of you who are allowing yourselves to be labeled in such a way as being lazy or whatever, even though the racial component, the deterministic component of this stereotype is obviously wrong, do not give credence whatsoever to that. We should be hard workers. We should be productive individuals, and we should be creating charitable organizations to work together, and voluntary organizations to work together. And there's a story I could tell related to that. But yeah, it's the mode is so much more individualistic in so many different aspects that, you know, it's the complete reverse. The collectivism is on the outskirts and is vague, whereas it's the reverse in the modern movement.
So tell us a little bit about Rand's opposition to the Civil Rights Act in the 60s.
Yeah, I first want to say something about some of her observations, because she indicates some of her observations of the history of Reconstruction, what kind of happened at the time of the Civil War. And I just want to say, in kind of the landscape of early America, and even though she doesn't go into detail and is extra specific, she's very spot on in how she notices the trend. And I wish she knew about some of these heroes and was able to read them, because I would love to hear her commentary. I have no doubt that she would have employed a lot of these examples in the words of these people, because they were so individualistic and they were so pro-America. But so as I understand it, when it comes to the Civil Rights Act, Ayn Rand is very much recognizes that it's important to make a distinction in terms of private and public, and that this idea of collective, what I don't know if she uses this language in that essay specifically, but here's how I always love how to think about it. This idea of collective guilt, of the sins of the past, of you know, the wrongs that have been done by people of your racial category is completely wrong, and just accepting the very premise of the racist, because it's the inverse. It's the inverse of saying, you know, we have collective pride and all of these things, and trying to claim the non-voluntary, the non-accomplished, the non-achieved in your genetic characteristics, and then trying to legislate that into law is a major failure, and just a wrong way to go. And kind of it sets up, you know, all these different things, like the perfect example, which she does talk about, is quotas. It sets up a terrible system that punishes everybody. Nobody wins from this system in terms of the actual effects of the quotas, but in an intellectual and psychological perspective, it is a completely low self-esteem way to view kind of the whole situation.
So we have a bunch of super chat questions, but
do we?
Let me ask you. Yeah, we'll go to them. And by the way, guys, let's see. You can ask questions. So use the super chat feature if you'd like to ask questions. Stick to the topic, or something you think that you know Ibis has an opinion on. But the super chat is open, is available, and use it. So let me ask you about kind of current events, and primarily you mentioned this at the beginning. What is your view of this argument about systemic racism? To what extent is there systemic racism in our society today? To what extent was there in the past? And so do you think, what direction do you think we're actually moving in?
So I want to answer the second question first. I don't, from the ground level, I don't see us moving in a good direction, because on quote both sides, or from many of the different angles I see people trying to approach these topics, it's very non-individualistic, non-fundamental thinking about these issues, and not addressing the crux of them and the essential of them. Now, and pretty much just breeding more tribalistic thought and encouraging more tribalistic thought. And, you know, I get me and my friends, because I'm still part of this network of people from TikTok and stuff, we share tribalistic takes all day long. I probably have 10, 15 tribalistic type collectivist videos on my phone right now, waiting for me to watch, of crazy things being said on TikTok, you know, crazy things being said just out there in the culture, and you'd be surprised how many mainstream people are saying things that are just
from all sides.
from all sides. Somebody asked me about, these conservative pages yesterday. They asked me about these conservative pages constantly posting videos of, Black people attacking white people, it is a real phenomenon. It's a problem, but is that actually helping? Or is that actually getting somewhere when they say, they'll post something like, do you notice the problem? Do you notice a trend? And to me, it's just indicative of the fact that no one is actually operating on an individualistic mode of thinking, nor are they trying to address any root problems, which, psychologically, we talk about something maybe like self-esteem. We talk about the philosophy of individualism and how that could help us think through a lot of these racial issues. Now, let me get back to, you mentioned systemic racism, which has gone through different forms and conceptions. And I'm a Stokely Carmichael reader, so I get it straight from the source on what was meant by that. And the way it's expressed today, I find what most people mean and try to insinuate by it, it doesn't really exist. And I want to connect it to this history. Part of the reason I love studying the history and getting these lessons from history, as Ayn Rand often notes, history is like a laboratory for ideas,
Yep.
Using thought experiments, giving you a bunch of variables to think about. This history really gives you a sample of to really explore what it means to have whatever we mean by systemic racism, but racism implemented into our society, whether it is political or social, and different ways to actually deal with that. And a lot of what we see today, it's at least on the political side, on the political legal side, is almost non-existent. But socially, interestingly enough, I think there is a lot of racialized thinking, and I think a lot of it is actually in the mode that Ayn Rand hit on, that most people don't hit on, where it's, this kind of positive mode of, I always like to mention, like, we are the Slades, my last name Slade, we are the Slades, and we have these characteristics. And it's more in that kind of positive familial thinking, this more tribal thinking, but it's not couched in the racial language that people are used to. But it seems like that form of racialized thinking is on the uptick, and it's troublesome and worrisome to me. But like I said, the way a lot of people think and assert the claim of systemic racism, I don't think is true. And I think I indicated some of the things I indicated to you earlier about the founding, and when they talk about the nation being racist at its core, it is so far away from the truth, when not only was the principles is what made it possible. Because I always ask the question, why do you think a civil rights movement was possible in America? Is because of these principles, and these people taking these principles into hand and using them and developing them. And that's part of, it's not just like they spouted what the founders said. They developed these ideas that made it into changing our Constitution, changing our documents. And then you have things like, I don't think I mentioned this. Here's one little thing I like to bring up: the Articles of Confederation. When people talk about the founding of this country, it's rooted in racism. So the Articles of Confederation, which is like the Constitution before the Constitution, some people like to think of it. There was a vote to add the word white. The racist South wanted to add white into it, which would have completely changed the makeup of the country and would have had serious implications. That vote was lost 8-3, which is substantial. 8-3.
Yep, that's a big vote.
That's a big vote.
Yep.
8-3 to not add the word white. So then when you go forward to the Dred Scott decision, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, where Justice Taney is kind of trying to call on these historic points that this nation was founded for white people and racism, and Black people weren't voting at the founding. He's absolutely wrong. He's terribly wrong. And this is also a trend where I haven't got a name for it yet, but there's this trend where a lot of the ways people think about this seems to be Southern. They've taken on a lot of their facts, take on Southern propaganda, essentially. A lot of stuff, the way that a lot of people think about America's history, especially in the racial sense, comes from what ended up being, like, you could take the example of the lost cause myth. This Civil War wasn't really about slavery, it had nothing to do with slavery. Cotton was the most, abundant gold mine of America. It built America. All of these things are literally from Southerners who were arguing for people like John Hammond, John C. Calhoun, George Fitzhugh, people who were arguing for the positive good and the moral right of slavery. So it's just an interesting phenomenon to me.
Okay, let's do some of these super chats. We've already gone almost an hour and a half. Michael asks, did the founding fathers ever explicitly use the phrase individual rights? It seems to be only implicit in their writings. Was Rand the only thinker to explicitly use and place individual rights as the standard? I mean, they certainly use rights. I'm sure Locke uses individual rights. I'm pretty sure.
I'm not sure. I think I've seen Locke use individual rights before. I know he's used when they used the term civil rights, they used it to make a distinction between government and religion and kind of freedom from religion. But individual rights, I'm not too sure of. Definitely not. I haven't seen it come up with much frequency of note, but it's very seriously implied. I'll say that it's very much implied in the language that they use.
The rights are of individuals.
Individuals.
Yes, I think that's all over. That is what they mean by rights. I don't think they can conceptualize anything else.
And it comes out. Hey, I'll say that, and it comes out most. It comes out most when they're talking about, especially why we have it. When it comes out, when they're speaking about how it's from our individual nature, our independent nature as a rational, independent thinking being. They do talk about and this comes up in the debates on, are Black people capable of having rights? Are they worthy of natural rights? And it comes up in the context of, well, yes, they are. Even the ones that say this is kind of it comes up in the context of the people that say no, they're not capable of this type of rational, independent thinking. The opposition is saying no, they are absolutely capable, and it's usually proven and given as examples on individual case-by-case basis. I mean, and there's this famous example of like Benjamin Banneker and in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. And, Benjamin Banneker is like, what you said about Black people not being capable of independent individual, this higher level rational thinking. And then, he sends him, I think it's an almanac of his, and, Thomas Jefferson is like, this is incredible. I think he sends it to France or something like that. So yeah, this is
one. Let's see. Michael says the thinkers prior to Douglas are new to me. I could use a repeat of their names to aid further research. So Michael, get a pen and paper ready, Michael.
Get a pen and paper. So let's go with James Fortin, Richard Allen, Richard Purvis, Purvis, Charles Lennox Remond, and here's some people I should have mentioned, David Walker, who I'll say something, remind me to say something about David Walker, David Jenkins, and
I mean, that'll get them going, and
that'll get you going. And
so say something about David Walker.
Yeah, I'll say something. And just to throw this out, I will post some stuff in the comment section. I'm a big YouTube guy, so I'll be in your comment section after the video and on my Twitter. Shout out to my coach at ARU, Don Watkins, the great, awesome Don Watkins. He told me that I should be active on Twitter after this. So if you guys follow my Twitter, I will be repeatedly posting a lot of these speeches, these great pieces of writings for the rest of my life for you guys on Twitter.
Excellent. So go the Twitter link is at the bottom of the description in the video. So go find that. It's also on the I think included in the podcast. So go to that and subscribe to Isiah's or Ibis's Twitter account.
So David Walker in 1830, and when tensions are really getting hot on, there's race riots, there's a lot of white terrorism at the time, because this is when we're picking up on racial tension. A lot of these, this is in the North Massachusetts area, but the racial tension is all across the North and the country as a whole, but especially in the North. You have you have the Cincinnati riots, which was a complete, terrible riot of white violence against Black people. But you have what's David Walker's appeal, which is given at a Black convention conference, because they start in 1830s. They start what's called the colored conventions, which go all the way until after Reconstruction, which are regular meetups in different towns, cities that happen, every year round. Black congregations. It started small, but they get up to 3,000 people. Very organized. We have the records of them. Very organized things. And he does this appeal that ends up getting rejected, by the way, by the Black delegates rejected it. But he publishes this fiery appeal. It's called David Walker's Appeal, that completely sends white people in the country, the racist white people, completely mad, because he's coming with this fiery language of the Declaration. You guys are not keeping to the founding principles. He's quoting, "We're all created equal," and he's like, our founding fathers, these great men have crafted this amazing document, and you guys are in contradiction to this. And slaves, we should pass this document. You should pass my book out, my appeal out to the slaves, and everybody should have this in their hand, because obviously they don't want this to happen. This is partly why the gag rule starts getting started as well, which I'll say sidebar is a great concrete example for anyone who wants to know what real censorship looks like. This history has concretes for everything, but this is what censorship looks like, the gag rules. But anyway, so he sends out this fiery appeal. It's a long appeal, of just crushing the arguments against Black inferiority and the argument for slavery, and it sends slave owners in the South mad, and it's a big fiasco, and it's a great piece of writing that I recommend you, Yaron. I would love to hear you talk about it in a video, but it's an amazing piece of writing.
Send me the link. So
Yes,
yes, I mean anything that sends slave owners into a mad frenzy gets a thumbs up from me. Let's see. Adam says, very interesting and informative. I'm curious if you find your interactions with modern day civil rights activists are positive, or are they less willing to engage in discussion of this history?
Actually, and this is why I'm glad you gave me the chance to come on here, because I think everybody should, it's not, you don't gotta have to go as deep as I did, but everybody should know this stuff as someone who supports America and wants to champion the principles, because I found in conversations, a lot of the concretes I'm able to weave in, especially with the philosophy of objectivism and the principles, it neutralizes people, and it actually gets people to sit down and listen. And I've had and trust me, I have a lot of we talked about my TikTok experiences. I used to be in debate rooms with 400 people on a Zoom call, just waiting to tear my head off. But it really neutralizes a lot of the concretes and examples I can pull out, neutralizes people and has them listen to what's being said, and it provides a nice bridge to communicate some of the higher level, more abstract things in such a way that, I mean, honestly, you can't say anything when I'm pulling out historical examples. I have the receipts, as they say, I have the receipts to back it up. And these arguments are so ironclad given by these people, and they're so strong and convincing and powerful. And what they did is so powerful that, but of course, you know, they stick to their views, obviously, but they're way more willing to listen than just versus, you know, just giving out, you know, typical examples or some of the other stuff that, you know, may be used, or the Thomas Sowell type of stuff or anything like that. But having this history behind to make your points, it's amazing. It's absolutely incredible. And people will listen.
Absolutely. Good. Let's see. Adam asks, could you comment on the influence of, God, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Yeah, I have no idea.
I wish I could see.
I'm going to copy paste this into the chat. Maybe you know how to pronounce this, or maybe you know who. Do you have the chat over there on
Yeah,
Zoom?
I do.
Where is it? There it is.
Is it Ta-Nehisi quotes?
No, it's not Ta-Nehisi quotes. It's something more complicated than that. It's that. And then there's a continuation. Founder of the Corps of Engineers and the Military Academies, and his Black student, Agrippa Hull, the pioneer of U.S. technology, in this case, ironwork startup.
I am, you know, thankfully, I don't think I said it in my intro, but I am absolutely by no means an expert, but I am a committed and interested student. And you have just given me another historical lead to search down on. I have no idea who this guy is.
I'm putting in the chat the second name as well. So
yeah, let me see the second name.
Yeah.
Agrippa Hull. These are names I'm not familiar with.
Good. Well, Adam, you expanded Ibis's horizons. This is good. This is good. It's a two-way street here. It's great. All right. Thanks. All right, guys, let me, oops, what did I do? That's it. Okay. Let me remind everybody that there is kind of a competition going on the Super Chat on the interviews. Right now, I think the record for Super Chat was done by Alex Epstein. So if you want Ibis to beat Alex, which would be cool. And if you beat Alex, it's cool in my book.
Super.
Me too, but it doesn't mean I don't want you to beat him. We've got a way to go. So 100 just to get to our 650 goal. And I think Alex was like close to 1,000, so or over 1,000. I can't remember, but we've got a while to go. So encourage you people, if you enjoyed this and you're benefiting and you want to see more of these interviews, then do Super Chats or just one of these, what do you call them? Stickers.
So I have something I can add.
We have a ton of questions. So
I'll do it real quick. On the last guy, he sent Agrippa Hull, just scrolling through the Wikipedia page. So it turns out he interned and worked for a period for the household and attorney of Elizabeth Freeman, Mum Bet. So this is I don't know if you've heard the story of Mum Bet, but this is a very interesting story. This is a woman who essentially freedom sued and won for her freedom in the early Republic. And I always like to talk about this example simply because, you know, it all started with her overhearing the discussion over the Massachusetts Constitution and the line, all men are created equal. And once she heard that, she went to this abolitionist attorney named Theodore Sedgwick and sued for her freedom. And that started a whole process where other people got freed, which then eventually led to the ending of the slave trade. So it's just, I always bring that up. And I did in my, the students loved it in my civil rights course at Higher Ground, because it's a perfect example of, on the concrete level, how these principles were like a woman overheard someone talking about the very idea. She couldn't, from what I've heard, she couldn't even write or read, but she overheard the idea. And as soon as she heard that, she pressed it and went to an attorney. They pressed it and she got her freedom. And there's a bunch of freedom suits just like that. So freedom suits in general are something to look up. And it's just you know, credence to like there's no place like America is the way I'll put it.
All right, Mike says, a great guest. It took someone who obviously understands individual rights and private property to tell me things I didn't know about, like the Black laws of the North and how things were bad in Reconstruction. Thank you, Mike. Yes, absolutely. I agree with all that. Ian says, very interesting history that I didn't know very well. I hope that in addition to TikTok and YouTube, Ibis writes some essays and books at some point. Would love to read more from him.
One of my great mentors, C. Bradley Thompson and Greg Salmieri, have definitely encouraged me to. I have told me I've pitched like 2 books. They say I have some good book ideas. Excellent. And then I'm working with shout out to the Undercurrent. I will be, and ARU, my professor Keith Lockett, who's teaching me how to be a great writer. I will be working on my writing skills and be writing a lot on a lot of this stuff and other topics. So coming soon, guys.
Looking forward to it. All right. A friend of Aristotle says, Isaiah, have you read or have you tried to read Ibram Kendi? If so, what's your opinion?
I've read some of Ibram Kendi.
There you go.
I'll just say very low tier intellectual. And after, like I said, after you read some of it, pales in comparison to some of these heroes I read. Honestly, that's what I'll say. If you want to read somebody who and you want to read about people who know what they're talking about and who have something fundamental and important to say, please check out some of these early Black leaders, because Ibram Kendi he's essentially a charlatan, and people deserve a better.
And he's capitalizing on guilt, on collectivism, on subjectivism. I mean, tribalism. I mean, it really is horrible.
Hopefully, I intend to make my way onto a stage with him one day, and
cool.
I'll say that.
Looking forward to that. All right, Joey asks, can you articulate the distinction between what objectivists mean by systemic, in the context of systemic racism, I assume, and what the leftists mean by systemic in the phrase systemic racism, the rational versus the irrational use of the term?
Now, I think, well, and maybe you'll have a different view of this. I find that the adjective systemic, sometimes it creates more, in some cases it creates more confusion than necessary. But my best shot at it is the rational, a rational take on what systemic would mean and would have to mean would be, and we kind of went over this at the seminar. Mm-hmm. It would have to mean something like, when we're talking about politically, something that's embedded into the legal system. It gets fuzzy, or it's explicitly into the legal system, and it gets fuzzy when we're talking about maybe private. And I think there's somewhere where a private and public distinction should be made, because it gets a little fuzzy when we're talking about maybe a private corporation who may have, in the seminar we use this example of corporate culture, and there are corporate cultures that could be throughout the company, but is systemic the right word for it?
Yeah,
I don't think so. And I think it creates more trouble than being able to actually understand the phenomena that's going on. And
because I agree with that. I think the left purposefully doesn't want to define it, because they wanted to leave it vague, so for them it means there's a lot of racism out there, or there's the cops are racists, or the institutions are racist. But you see, their standard for racism is, and this is interesting, the standard for racism is outcomes are not equal. So their proof of systemic racism is blacks generally are poorer than whites. They shouldn't be. We're all equal. So the fact that they're poorer than whites means there must be racism, or there are more blacks in jail than there are whites. Therefore, there must be systemic racism in the criminal justice system and things like that.
Which, again, throwback real quick to this history. Such an argument never comes up when they're mentioning the racism that exists. And of course, part of that is because most of it is explicit. But there's cases where they're talking about things that may not be explicit. But it's never some argument like there's we're looking at the consequences at what's happening to people or things like that. or, you know, this weird type of disparity argument. It's always rooted in something that you can actually concretely point to and show how the mechanisms are working and how they, you know, I always give the example, like I spoke a little about the vagrancy laws and how after legislation went past, so it was like we have to implement race neutral laws, they used the vagrancy laws. Yes, they didn't address these activists didn't address the vagrancy laws, but some of the people were able to key into the fact that, you know, this he last year he presented us a law, this same law, and it had racist language in it. He was trying to do it against Black people. Now it says vagrancy, but all of them walk around applying it to Black people, and they apply the law wrongly. And that's what we're against. That's what they would say. We're against this idea that in America, we apply the law unequally to citizens of America. That's explicitly what they're against. They said literally, that is un-American. That is un-American. That is not what America represents. It represents the rule of law and due process of law.
That's great. All right. Richard says, I wonder if slavery left a residue of institutional dependence that manifests as reparations, the demand for reparations, for example. Have your studies found historical examples of exploitation of Black dependence?
And maybe you have a different view, but I'm very hesitant against that. Specifically, I think because of the work of Robert Higgs and Thomas Sowell. I think they do great economic work on this front and economic historical work in showing that, you know, once the barriers come down, the Black growth is so especially in the Reconstruction era, actually, even is so expansive. It's so quick. And I think what's the stat? It climbs, I think, right after the Civil War in the Reconstruction period to the 1900s. I think the economic growth, the rate was like double that of the country itself or something like that, of the Black communities. It's so incredible, the fortitude. And, you know, right now I've been reading a lot about Black wealth even during, you know, the early 1900s. It's this idea of dependency. I think it's just deterministic to me. It's just deterministic thinking. It's shot through to me. And
well, there's an aspect of it I think the welfare state has created.
Yeah, exactly. You know, which is what I think Thomas Sowell has been able to show, that really what happens is we don't just see this long block of decline. We actually see a lot of progress, a huge amount of progress, and then we don't see necessarily this complete drop off. We see drop offs in certain areas, in certain aspects, which I'm a big advocate of, individualizing your perspective in looking at statistics.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like you be very suspicious of aggregating your view on when looking at statistics and economics, especially wealth growth, because there's so many variables to consider that don't capture what individuals are doing.
Thank you, Richard. All right. On the Leroy says, what do you see in the US today that gives you hope for the future?
Oh my God. I mean, every time I go to, maybe this is a little cheeky and a cheap answer, it's a cop-out answer, but every time I go to Ocon, I see a lot of hope.
There you go.
Every time I watch the Yaron Brooks show, I got a lot of hope. I mean, I got
you guys should be hopeful because Ibis is going to start a YouTube channel. That's
yeah. I mean, I do watch a lot. Okay, so I do watch a lot of YouTube, and even there's a lot of, especially, well, maybe more in the history space. Yeah, maybe some economic YouTubers, but there's a lot of great history YouTubers out there who aren't objectivists, but who have when you follow the facts of history, they come out with so many great ideas and so much great things to say and great perspectives. They may not be all the way, but that type of stuff, it gives me way more hope than what's happening politically. There's especially YouTube. What happens on the rational parts of YouTube gives me way more hope than what's happening in politics. And you know, there are pockets out there. And again, to throw back to this history, one of the things that I kept going over with the students to take from this history as a guide, as a lesson is, you know, this gives you a lot of thinking food for how to collaborate, how to change the world. I mean, I didn't get a chance to, because I messed up my talking notes here, but
Yeah.
a big part of this is how much these people were, they were in most places 1% of the population without the ability to vote, but were able to command not only political but social and economic power through these ideas, through perseverance, and able to change minds. And I think, of course, in some ways, convincing people of objectivism is harder than convincing people to end slavery. But in other aspects, is either way, it's an uphill battle, but it's so possible. And studying this history kind of gives you a lot of a rubric how to do it. And there's a lot of optimism to be had, and go check out Yaron's speech on rational optimism.
All right, so let's try to make, not that you're going long, but let's try to make shorter answers, because
we're piling up.
An hour 45 in, and we've got a ton of questions still. All right, Jennifer asks, how do you think Reconstruction would have been different if Lincoln had not been assassinated?
Oh, this is always a hard one. Well, I'll say, well, partly one of the problems in kind of doing the what if is because we do not know. He never came out explicitly for repeal of Black laws. We saw a lot of examples of him getting his mind changed and coming more on to the side, but Lincoln was very much on that side of not wanting to agitate not just the South, but the political scene with federal overstepping. And, and that ties into the whole, I get angry when people talk about Lincoln as a tyrant, because how is he a tyrant when he's so worried about overstepping his federal bounds, and it held him back so much. But, I think we would have gotten at least more pressure on the South to not put in, a lot of they wouldn't have gotten off so easy. I think a lot of Southerners who ended up taking up political positions wouldn't have gotten off so easy. And more on the social level, I think the momentum wouldn't have been, the wind wouldn't have been taken out of the sails of, the northern side. That's all I can say.
Mike says, good discussion and ideas and principles. Thanks, Mike. Vadim says, why do rappers use the N-word in their songs? I asked this once, and the reply I got was, I wouldn't understand. Thank you.
Right. Quick answer is because it's seen as, it's seen as a like we can and you can't type of thing. And it's seen as a slang. There's the old, we reclaim the word. And that might be where the you can't understand thing. It's we reclaimed the word. It may not, it's not a term of endearment coming out of your mouth, but and it's part of the culture. Is usually it's part of the culture. It's part of,
you view it as a tribal thing that they have this attitude.
Yeah, it's essentially a tribal attitude. It's pretty much part of it's part of the collective. It's same way how, and it even breaks down. There's the classic example of it breaking down. Like I'm from New York. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, where if you grew up with a bunch of Puerto Rican and Spanish kids who grew up near us, say it. And they don't have a problem with them saying, but you go uptown and some kid from Manhattan saying it, and that's a big issue. Some white kid from Manhattan saying that's a big issue. So it's yeah, but don't say it. Just don't say it.
Marilyn says, I first learned of Mr. Ibis when Rucker interviewed him and two other gentlemen from ARC UK. He called Rucker sir, maybe the first time Rucker's ever been called sir. The TikTok objectivists. All right. Thanks,
I would have called you sir, Yaron, but you were adamant about me calling you Yaron.
I do not like it. All right. Harper says, many respects, I'm a social egalitarian. I think some people would not like that, but I don't dress my parts, and I don't like being called doctor or so. Harper asks, is Ayn Rand known in the Black community? That's question one. And the second question is, do you feel racism has held you back in your life or career?
No, she's not. Any person that usually any Black person I find that knows of Ayn Rand is more on the left side, and they have heard the nonsense. But funny instance, my uncle actually has read Ayn Rand's book when he was younger.
Wow.
So yeah, she has influence, she has spread. And you know, we're out here, we're individuals, and some of us seek it out, and it happens. And I think it'll spread more. Hopefully I can, you know, have an impact on that. And secondly, no, not even in the slightest. I've had instances, you know, experiences with racism, but it's never held me back. And I've always, even before objectivism, which is why I think I was down with objectivism almost immediately, is because I've been an individualist at heart since forever. I've been a selfish individualist forever. It never
So even though
fazed
you
me.
experienced racism, you didn't let it get to you.
Absolutely not. It just, if it was I was always had the attitude, it's your loss. You're crazy, especially in the classic examples at the workplace. I've been working since I come from a West Indian background. If you're going to have preconceived notions about me because of my race, you're crazy, because I'm 9 times out of 10, I'm the best worker you've got coming through the building. So your loss.
Great answer. All right, Marilyn says, Mr. Isiah, what got you interested in Montessori?
Oh, well, that's an easy one. Actually, part of it was just the ideas of, I actually ended up, you know, going through all the objectivist videos. I ended up reaching you know, some Matt Bateman videos and hearing Ayn Rand talk about her. But then the great and wonderful Greg Salmieri ended up connecting me with Higher Ground for a diversity project. And because of that, you know, as you guys can see, once I find out about something, I dive in deep, and I found Montessori just a fascinating woman, and just, you know, just an incredible person. And I've always been interested in, so here's the biggest thing, and I'll end it quickly. I was one of those students who got stunted. I got, you know, I had so much passion, so much potential, and it got stunted. So finding out about someone like that was amazing. Oh, and I've always been a Marva Collins fan as well. So it just connected. Two powerful educators.
Collins was amazing. Yep. All right. Apollo Zeus asks, the Great Migration was 1910 to 1970. What happened before 1870, before 1910 to lead to that? I think we talked about that a little bit, but why, what was the instigation for the Great Migration?
Well, on the kind of political, social side was the rise of, so the uptick in racism, they start to feel more comfortable. And then, you know, towards the 1910s, it really hits this peak of like, yeah, we're way away from Reconstruction now. No one's trying to force us to be equal under the law. So they just, you know, Jim Crow went, you know, full in on it. And by the way, most people don't know, Jim Crow didn't even involve much, you know, racially explicit laws. They were pretty racially neutral on the face of it, but racism was, they just felt comfortable. They felt bolstered. And it's the cultural aspects of racism are just interesting, but it's just that rise in collective. I think it goes with that.
Police not enforcing the law when it comes to
Yes.
whites killing blacks. And I mean, people should go see the movie Till. I don't know if you saw Till. I thought it was very well done. And it gives you that sense of how screwed up the system is, even though theoretically the laws on the books against murder, but when you won't convict a white guy for killing somebody who's black, then the laws are meaningless.
And like we talked about, there was a lot of collectivist elements otherwise coming in as well. So, I mean, collectivism, tribalism are just a recipe for its lowest form, which is racism. It's, you know, it's a recipe for disaster there.
Which the movie's Till, T-I-L-L. Emmett. It's about Emmett Till's.
Oh.
It's about Emmett Till, but really about his mother and what happens around his murder.
And for some good background on Emmett Till's story, you should check out T.R.M. Howard, who was a big civil rights hero, very good guy, and he was one of the major advocates and pushers to get something done about that case. And he's another one of my civil rights heroes.
So James G asks, what happened to Black Wall Street after the collapse?
So, sort of, I always answer this question first by pointing out there was a few Black Wall Streets. You know, I don't know about collapse wouldn't be the word. I mean, they kind of got, when you use the word collapse, it got destroyed. But I take the note of the question is kind of like, why didn't it get rebuilt? And I mean, it's a little bit hard to say, but because a lot of the ideological stuff, a lot of ideas behind it, the people, the individuals behind building Black Wall Street, they just weren't around anymore. And the ideological culture shifted. One of the guys who founded Black Wall Street is a gentleman named Charles Spalding. I've done some research into him. He's, you know, these were industrious, to use Booker T's language. These were industrious, productive individuals, and their like was going out of style. So once something like that happens and there's no one to pick up those pieces, you know, who's starting insurance companies? Like that's how Black Wall Street kind of got. It was an insurance company that he started that then funded a lot of the other stuff. Like, who's doing that anymore? It's just not happening in the community.
Okay, Buzz says, how do we fix public housing and rent control in New York City? You can't fix it. You have to get rid of it.
You have to get rid of it.
You abolish it.
You abolish it. But I guess the only other answer you could give is, like kind of Thomas Sowell points out, it wasn't always that bad, because the people, the thought process of the people who were inhabiting it were of a different generation, right?
Yeah.
Public housing wasn't always a terrible place, but when the philosophy, the good philosophy, has been completely sucked out of the environment, there's nothing left to grab onto.
Yeah, and I blame the welfare state for most of that. I think public housing, the decline in public housing is a consequence of the welfare state. Rent control is always bad. There's never a good part of. Whoops. Greg wrote a comment, and then Greg, the famous Greg, wrote a comment, and then he deleted it. So before I get a chance to read it, all right, maybe he'll write it again. There was a typo there. I did catch that. Let's see. Boss says, good stuff. Consider open your own YouTube channel. Yeah, he said he's going to. So
yeah, well, we have one that has like 3,000 subscribers on it. So we have a great, maybe I'll plug. I have a great interview. It's Aporia. We have a Aporia YouTube channel. There's a great interview with C. Bradley Thompson on there. There's a clip from I've been on Larry Elder show. There's a clip on there.
Oh, you have? Good.
Yes. Good. Yes. So yeah, and we have some content on there as well. And we intend to produce more.
All right. So it already exists. Go subscribe. Shazbat says, has MLK's I Have a Dream speech become unpopular among today's critical race theory activists?
Now, I think a lot of that stuff has just become, it's empty words. It's words that you use to make a point. A lot of his things he said has just became, battering rams for people. But I don't think people really dive deep into much of what the ideas. Really? I don't think they engaged with MLK. I committed that. I didn't even say my big MLK quote that I have there that most people don't hear. Should I say it now? Because it's a great quote. So here's an MLK quote that most people don't know of. He goes, of the two dominant and contradictory strains in the American psyche, the positive one, our democratic heritage, was the later development on the American continent. Democracy, born in the 18th century, took from John Locke of England the theory of natural rights and the justification of revolution, and imbued it with the ideal of a society governed by the people. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the first government of the world to be based on these principles was established on American soil. Based on that, a contemporary description of Benjamin Franklin might have described the new nation. He has torn lightning from the sky. Soon he will tear the scepters from the kings. And Thomas Paine, in this enthusiasm, declared, "We have the power to begin the world over again." And I just thought, I never knew. I always quote that because, MLK touching on all those different founders, all those great people.
Is that from is that an anniversary of Lincoln's?
That's not even in a speech. That's from the "Where Do We Go From Here" book. Which is why
there's a great speech of MLK's where he talks about the importance of the Declaration of Independence and why the Declaration of Independence is the fundamental document underlying the. So he had some really good stuff, even though he had a streak of socialism or welfareism in him. He had some really good content.
I think he was like really the last of the intellectual civil rights heroes. So.
Yeah. All right, let's see. A lot of people gave money without asking a question. So thank you to all of you guys. I don't have time to scroll back and find you all, but thank you. Thank you, Joseph. Just came in. Okay, we've got like 6 more questions. Gail says, so happy to hear you. Yes, we need to have your historical experiences of neutralizing people by building a bridge. So she liked that. That's great.
Try.
Thanks, Gail. Jean says, loved watching your debates. Thanks. Thanks. You've done a lot of debates.
Yeah, I've done a lot. Yes. Thank you for attending.
Frank says, are reparations against the southern states valid?
I don't think so. Not at all, really. It's just another form of, holding a collective, especially in the past, holding a collective group for the sins of their collective. The southern states are not some person out there. The southern states were ruled by individuals that aren't alive anymore, and there's different individuals who aren't that great at politics right now running them, but those reparations won't help anybody. What we need is a individualist path forward.
Right. So Greg says, also regarding rebuilding Black Wall Street, he says, also it would have been especially hard to do in a context where it had been demonstrated that the police wouldn't protect it from violence.
Exactly.
Basically, in a state of anarchy or a state of threat like that, what are you going to rebuild if know it will be destroyed tomorrow?
Yeah, most people don't know this. They were defending. They were getting prepared to defend that. They were defending themselves at Black Wall Street, and they alerted the officials, but nobody came, and nothing happened. So,
yeah, those of you who don't know about the story of Black Wall Street, look it up. It's a dark story of American history. Okay, Joseph does have a question. He just hit it. So let's see if I can find. There it is. What are your thoughts on Coleman Hughes, particularly his work on racism, but also his wider cultural views? I've heard him dismiss Ayn Rand.
I'm a big fan of Coleman. He's one of the people I have a gripe with, who I say he took my job. He has my position on YouTube, but more kudos to him. He does great work on that issue. Of course, as with most people, coming from an objectivist perspective, sometimes I don't think he goes to the fundamental issue enough. I don't think he hits completely in the thread of individualism and having a view that broadens and applies to all of, like you indicated, all of his cultural views and integrates with most of his views. And I think he has some shortcomings in that aspect. But, and that takes away from some of his commentary on certain things. But I mean, given the field out there, he's definitely one of the better people. Him and, oh my God, why is he slipping my mind right now? The race abolitionist, I met him. Oh my God, why is he slipping? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Suddenly slipping my mind. So, but then everybody's name slips in my mind. All right. While you look that up, are you familiar with Daryl Davis, the Black musician who converts Ku Klux Klan members? Very cool story.
Yes, I'm familiar with Daryl Davis. I have some qualms about if I would spend my time on such an endeavor, but it is a very cool story, and I'm familiar with his story, and I guess it's a testament to how, I guess, when you present some people just need to be met with some type of rational thought. But Daryl Davis, I think has some other thoughts that, again, same kind of thing, don't integrate into it. He's a mixed bag.
Yeah. John
Camille Foster. I'm sorry. Camille Foster was the name I was thinking of. Camille Foster, great guy. You should check him out.
Good. John Jeffers says, thank you for such a cogent summary of portions of American history many of us do not know enough about. On a separate topic, any recommendations for new parents on specific books to read about Montessori education? Well, I would read Maria Montessori's books. I mean, they're fabulous. They're easy reads. They're not hard. I remember when I was going to have kids, I picked up all of her books and just read them, and they're fantastic. Any other recommendations?
I would recommend actually maybe not a book, but get plugged into wherever you can find what Matt Bateman is putting out. He's always giving more information on where you can find interesting thing and giving interesting commentary on stuff and giving great ideas on parenting and on those aspects. And I'm pretty sure Higher Ground also has some resources that would be of help to you as well, if you just, look them up.
Yeah, look them up. They probably have some resources regarding Montessori for you to find. All right, let's see. Ryan says, awesome guest and show. Thank you both. Thanks, Ryan. And then Ryan says, goal accomplished. All right, Ryan, we did. We blew through the goal. Excellent. I don't think we made it quite up to Alex Epstein level, but then, it's those are giant peaks to get to. Greg says, for new parents, Montessori from the start is also useful. So Montessori from the start is the name of the book that Greg Salmieri recommends on this topic. I don't know if Greg has been commenting throughout our discussion. I've only noticed him in the last few minutes. But he is there. All right. Thank you, Ibis. This has been fantastic. I've learned a lot. That is really exciting. And the beauty of it is there's a lot more content there. I know.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you on YouTube. I'm looking forward to reading the Undercurrent, but ultimately I'm looking forward to the book and to the competition.
Yes.
Bring it on, man.
Well, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you to you. Thank you for the influence you've had on my journey. And thank you to everybody at Ayn Rand Institute. I know they sponsor the show, so thank you to them. Thank you to the Ayn Rand University. And, shout out to everybody watching from TikTok and Instagram, all my internet support groups. We made it, guys. We made it. Made it
Absolutely.
to the Yaron Brook show.
There you go. Now you gotta climb the next mountain.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thanks to all the super chatters. You guys were very generous today. Really, really appreciate it. I will be back tomorrow morning. We'll have a show tomorrow morning. We'll have a show on Saturday at 3 p.m. And we are doing a members only show on Sunday. And then Monday, we'll do a show in the morning and in the evening, because then Tuesday, I fly to Medellin. Now, I never thought I'd ever say that I'm going to Medellin, because I grew up in a period where Medellin was the drug capital of the world and very violent and very dangerous. But supposedly it's calmed down and it's peaceful and it's very nice. That's what they tell me. If I find something different when I get there, I'll let you guys know. But I'm going on a 2.5 week trip to South America. So but I will see you guys tomorrow morning. Thank you, Ibis, Isiah. I look forward to seeing you on all these other platforms. I'll see you at OCON.
Yes, sir. I'm making sure I get there.
Excellent. Good. Thanks, guys. Have a great night, everybody. It's getting late over here. Bye and good night.
All right. Thank you.